Hello, it's Dr. Cindy with this week's Mental Health Moment. Last week I talked about the shadow, which is the collection of our repressed feelings, thoughts, and impulses that can affect us outside of our conscious awareness. I used the example of selfishness as one such emotion that we often reject due to early learning that makes us feel badly about this aspect of ourselves. Today I'm going to talk more about the tension many people feel when decisions they are wanting to make on their behalf run counter to that conditioning around generosity and giving. Let's start with three typical scenarios that demonstrate the ways in which children might be taught about how to handle situations in which their own wants and needs conflict with those of others. Number one, a little girl in a parent-child play group is playing with some toys when another child comes over and takes one from her. The girl starts to protest, but her mother says, "Oh, that's okay, let her play with that. You have these other toys." Number two, a child wins a prize in a game at his church, and another child starts to cry in disappointment over not winning. The father encourages his child to give them the prize because they're so upset. Number three, after unwrapping all of his presents on Christmas Day, a boy excitedly opens up the Lego set that he had been hoping for. His brother comes over and wants to play with it too, but the boy says he wants to build it all by himself. His parents tell him he needs to share and let his brother help. Now, at first glance, these all sound like examples of parents trying to teach their children how to be generous and the importance of sharing, and that is certainly the intention of their efforts. However, I would suggest that perhaps something very different is being inadvertently taught instead. In the first example, the girl is trying to advocate for herself when the toy she is playing with is taken away. Rather than supporting the daughter's efforts to communicate her feelings to the other girl, the mother tries to bypass a potential conflict by redirecting her to be content with the other toys. By stopping this process, the mother essentially communicates to her daughter to accept when others violate her boundaries rather than to assert and stand up for her own feelings. The girl will likely feel that it wasn't okay for her to ask for the toy back and will learn to suppress and ignore her own emotions if they conflict with other people's. Think about how that might play out for her when she is older and, for example, the person she's dating wants a level of physical contact with her that she's not comfortable with. If she's been taught that she should give in to what others want over expressing and standing up for how she feels, then she might comply in ways that are in violation of what she is truly comfortable with. The well-meaning father of the child who won the prize unknowingly sent the message that the other child's disappointment over losing the contest mattered more than his own child's excitement and joy about winning. His child is stuck with the dilemma of keeping the prize and displeasing his father, and also having to continue to witness the other child being upset, or giving up the prize to make the other child happy. That ends up turning winning the contest into a no-win situation in which it will be hard to feel good about either decision. In the case of the boy with the Christmas present, he has to choose between honoring the excitement and enjoyment of building the Lego set on his own, in defiance of his parents, or letting his brother help against his own wishes. He is clearly outnumbered in this situation, with three people wanting him to do something that he doesn't want to do. So he will likely allow his brother to join him in order to make the others happy at the expense of his own happiness. In all three cases, the children are put in a position of having to decide whose feelings matter more, their own or someone else's. And the learning that takes place is that they should deny what they are wanting if it conflicts with what another person wants. Over time, it starts to feel bad to have their own wants and wishes because these don't seem to be well received or valued by those around them, and they will start feeling guilty whenever they have such desires. They may think of themselves as bad for not wanting to share because everyone else is communicating that that is what they are supposed to do. Now you might be thinking, but Dr. Nye, don't we need to teach our children to care about other people's feelings? Absolutely. But think about how much in the course of a typical day, children are asked and expected to do what others want them to do, rather than what they themselves want. Get dressed, brush your teeth, come to the table, clean your room, do your homework, go to bed. The majority of children's time is spent with other people telling them what to do, and with them experiencing consequences if they don't comply. I would also argue that children are actually already naturally very aware of and sensitive to the feelings of others. That's adaptive to their survival. And as I've talked about before, it is through this attentiveness to other people's emotions that children learn the rules of engagement and develop their sense of themselves in relation to others. True compassion, empathy, and generosity are not taught by requiring children to disregard their own emotions for the sake of someone else's. It is through honoring children's feelings as being valid and acceptable that we help them develop that same attitude about how others feel. So, how might these three scenarios have been handled more effectively? In the first example, the mother could have allowed her daughter to say, "I'm playing with that," when the other girl took the toy, and then given both children a chance to work it out. If they struggled to resolve it themselves, the mom could ask her daughter if she would be willing to give the other girl a time frame after which she would let her have a chance to play with it. Note that this honors the fact that the daughter still wants to play with the toy, while also acknowledging that the other girl would like a turn and communicating the expectation for sharing. When handled this way, children will often willingly share a toy after very little time because often their reaction is less about the specific toy itself and more about having it taken from them. And lest you think I'm only throwing other parents under the bus, the second scenario was based on a situation that I was actually involved in. My son had won a giant Hershey Kiss, and one of the other boys at our church became very upset and started crying about not winning. Now, I'd like to think that I truly gave my son a choice about whether or not to give up the candy, but no matter how I presented that idea to him, I suspect that he wanted to please me by going along with the suggestion, even though he really wanted to keep it for himself. He did clearly feel upset by how distressed the other boy was, but rather than telling him how to make it better, I wish I had just talked with him about how he was feeling about the situation. If I had facilitated my son communicating to me that he was really wanting to keep the chocolate, but also didn't want the other boy to feel bad, then he might have come up with the thought himself of giving the candy away and then could have felt good about it. That way, it was coming from his own generosity rather than his desire to please or not disappoint me. In the third situation involving the boy with the Lego set, when parents mandate that their children always have to share everything with their brothers and sisters, that can generate a great deal of resentment among siblings because, again, it doesn't feel good to have to share something. And in the case of something that's particularly special to a child, it is important to allow them to designate those things as being off limits, just as we do as adults. I don't share everything that I own, but I am certainly happy to share most of it. That isn't promoting stinginess or greed. And more often than not, if kids are allowed to keep their prized possessions all to themselves, they will be much more generous with their other things. So the element of choice is important in how we feel about giving to others. In a study of 3 and 5-year-olds, children who were required to share their stickers with another child were observed to not feel positively about this experience. Children who were given the choice to share showed happiness when doing so. You can teach and promote empathy and compassion, but you can't mandate them. Forcing or guilting a child into an act of generosity might elicit the desired behavior, but it makes it an emotionally aversive experience. Enough of those experiences could lead to resistance or resentment around giving, which doesn't truly teach the emotional value of generosity coming from genuine compassion and care. Fast forward to adulthood from those types of early experiences, and we end up with interactions and relationships in which it can be very difficult to even know, much less honor, what is important to us deep down. Requests or expectations from people are received as obligations and something we feel we have to do, and we find ourselves begrudgingly doing what others want from us, even if it's not what we ourselves are wanting. I hear all the time of situations in which people end up saying yes when they really wanted to say no. They don't give themselves permission to decline what is being asked of them because they feel guilty and think it would be selfish. And while saying yes might initially keep the peace within the relationship with the other person, it wreaks havoc on our own internal peace because we are repeatedly making someone else's feelings more important than our own. On some level, we also end up feeling badly about the other person. We might feel angry and put upon that they are making the request of us rather than recognizing their right to do so. We may think they are being selfish and not thinking about our feelings. But if we aren't going to take our own feelings into consideration, how can we expect anyone else to? And we invariably end up feeling resentful as though we are being forced to do something against our will. So we hold it against the other person and may even feel that they owe us in some way. Meanwhile, as far as the other person is concerned, we said yes out of true willingness, and they have no idea how their request is affecting us. Now, none of this means that we should only look out for ourselves in our own interests, always do what we want no matter how other people feel, and not take other people's feelings into consideration. If you're hearing that in what I'm saying, I challenge you to consider that maybe the fear of your selfish shadow coming into play. Extremes in either direction, in this case, selfish or being 100% selfless, are not healthy or adaptive. And let's reflect on the word selfless for a moment. It means having no concern for self. How does that help us psychologically if we truly have no concern for ourselves? And even being literally selfless, which implies caring less for ourselves than others, is dangerous territory because our own feelings matter just as much as anyone and everyone else's. So you can see how this dichotomy around being selfish versus selfless is very tricky. In fact, it was interesting when I Googled the word selfless and read some of the first prompts that came up, as they seemed pretty contradictory. One was, is being selfless good? And the answer, being selfless helps us identify and connect with others, and that in and of itself is rewarding. It helps squash our egos because we are not acting out of pride or for a desire to be noticed. Selflessness helps us act from our heart and soul instead of our ego, tapping into our true desired feelings. Well, then I read, is being selfish a bad thing? Selfless a bad thing? And the response, although helping others can benefit our health, happiness, and relationships, being too caring can sometimes have downsides. For example, people who are especially selfless may end up feeling exploited in their interpersonal relationships or burned out in their jobs. Okay? And finally, the question, can you be too selfless in your relationships? The answer, according to a new study, people who are concerned about others have higher well-being, but only if they respect their own needs. So it's all about balance. The middle ground of most things tends to be the healthiest and happiest, but our polarizing brains take us to the extremes. This is evident even in our language. We have synonyms and antonyms to describe things that are similar and opposite. But what words do we have for the in-betweens? We have selfless and selfish, generous and greedy, but no word for that wide expanse of options in the middle. We aren't either or, we are all. And when we assign labels to human inclinations and behaviors, those often become judgments or expectations that make us feel as though we have to strive to be one way and not the other, rather than allowing for the full range of all possibilities and ideally a balance between the extremes. So maybe the vast middle ground between generosity and greed is giving, where people do things for other people at varying degrees based on the particulars of each situation. People are most likely to give freely when they feel fulfilled and as though they themselves have enough. If I feel depleted and empty, I may genuinely want to help others, but it will be incredibly difficult for me to do so. So being aware of our own capacity and resources and taking care of ourselves based on that enables us to be able to care about and for others. And that happens when we respect, value, and honor our own feelings, in addition to respecting, valuing, and honoring other people's. Repeatedly making decisions based on how other people feel with no consideration of ourselves comes at a very high cost. Giving freely happens when we feel free rather than obligated to give. When we honor our right to choose, the help and support we give to others comes from a genuine desire to do so rather than a demand or expectation. Doing things out of guilt or obligation isn't giving freely and can be emotionally detrimental personally and in relationships with others. So let's talk about how, on a practical level, we can make decisions about what we are asked to give. in a relationship that is sensitive to how both parties feel, rather than perpetuating that false dichotomy of caring about others at the expense of ourselves versus caring about ourselves at the expense of others. I am going to focus specifically on situations in which someone asks for some type of help or assistance. People who struggle with feeling obligated to be there for others, no matter what, will often reflexively say yes to all requests for help. They don't want to be seen as being selfish, so they don't even consider that saying no is an actual option. When I ask them about this, they will often say they would feel too guilty if they said no and that they don't want the other person to be upset with them. But what often happens in this scenario is that they themselves end up feeling upset. When they hang up the phone, they are flooded with regret about saying yes and resistance to providing the help that they just agreed to. They realize they really don't want to do it and feel angry with themselves for making that commitment. They might think about backing out, but then worry that the other person would be upset and think poorly of them. They may then begin to feel irritated and frustrated with the other person for this imposition. And because they have agreed to help out of obligation and guilt rather than a genuine desire, they then dread having to follow through with helping the other person because it requires them to suppress their own feelings and take action that runs counter to what they are really wanting. So this becomes a very unpleasant situation that can leave them feeling depleted and put upon and like nobody cares about how they feel, which in this case is actually quite true since the only person who knew about how they were feeling, which is they themselves, chose to ignore that in deference to the person making the request. So if your reflex is to say yes when others ask something of you, I would encourage you to give yourself permission to not answer right away. Buy yourself some time. Instead of automatically saying yes, develop the habit of saying, let me get back to you. It is much easier to come back later and say, I'm sorry, I can't, when you haven't already said yes. But even if you accidentally say yes at first, it is important to give yourself permission to still decline to help if you really don't want to. You could say, I thought about it some more and I'm sorry, I just can't. This is obviously a bit trickier and the other person may feel some disappointment that you backed out, but that's okay. You are not making this decision to be hurtful or because you don't care about how the other person feels. You are making it because you care about how you feel. Once you have bought yourself some time by telling the other person you'll get back to them, reflect on the request and ask yourself, do I want to do that? And pay attention to how you feel, not what you think, which will be based on your conditioning around how you define generosity and selfishness, but how you feel when you imagine providing the help that is being requested. Notice what is happening in your gut. Our gut reaction is often our initial signal of what we truly feel about something before our brain gets involved. If deep down you really don't want to help, that's important to note and honor. That probably means the right answer is no. Write that down because you're going to need that to refer back to. Once you recognize that you don't want to help the other person, all kinds of thoughts will likely kick in to try to convince you not to go with that decision. Anything that starts with should or shouldn't is coming from guilt, obligation, and some level of concern about being selfish. Your brain will likely play out your worst fears about what it thinks will happen if you tell the other person you can't help. Try to remember that your mind is making all of this up, and just because it thinks it, that doesn't make it true. When you are prepared for this reaction, you may be able to step back and observe with interest how hard your brain is trying to talk you out of making the decision that feels right for you. In doing so, you can start to recognize how strong that ingrained mindset is that you are supposed to prioritize other people's feelings over your own. Another big barrier to saying no is feeling like you need to have a good reason. To this, I say you are the good reason. You are allowed to not want to do something, and you are allowed to make decisions based on that. No explanation is necessary in declining the other person's request for help. And I strongly encourage you not to try to come up with one. It is okay to simply say, I'm sorry, I can't help with that. If that is met with a request for a reason, maybe just say you've got too much going on right now and leave it at that. Also be vigilant for thoughts about good and bad, like I'm being a bad friend if I don't help, or a good daughter would do that for her mother. That clearly links back to childhood conditioning and what you were taught or decided were the rules for being loved. And because our brain is always looking to assign blame in problematic situations, it will either make you at fault for not wanting to help or fault the other person for daring to ask for help. So you may notice thoughts related to right and wrong, like it's wrong for me to not want to help, or it's wrong for him to ask me to do that. You might also start calculating what the other person has or hasn't done for you in the past as a way to justify for yourself your decision to say no. But no justification is needed, and no one is doing anything wrong. It is important to accept both our right to not want to do something and other people's right to ask us to do it. And if you wonder why people always come to you for help, consider that that might be because you always say yes. I also often hear, oh, she makes me feel so guilty, as a reason for being reluctant to say no. If you are feeling guilty, that's coming from you believing you are doing something wrong, stemming from your own beliefs and conditioning. When you fully give yourself permission to make your feelings just as important as anyone else's, you will no longer have anything to feel guilty about. It's also not reasonable or realistic to expect the other person to be happy about you saying no. They asked for help for a reason, and of course, they want you to say yes, and it's still okay to say no. Also, you don't actually know how the other person will feel. You can only imagine. And when you do, you will likely imagine the worst. And as much as you might struggle with the idea that the other person will feel bad if you say no, remember that you will feel bad if you say yes. Whose feelings are you responsible for? Of course, we all need to be sensitive to other people's emotions and not intentionally do things that are hurtful to them. But we also have the responsibility to be considerate of our own feelings and not purposely make decisions that are hurtful to us. Choosing to do what feels right for you, even though it might disappoint another person, isn't you being hurtful. It is you taking care of and being respectful of yourself. You are not declining help because you are selfish and greedy and don't want to be there for others. You are saying no because the help that is being asked isn't something you feel inclined or able to provide. Connecting to your heart is always a good way to quiet your mind, and when it kicks off the conditioned rules that you've imposed on yourselves. Validate your feelings about not wanting to help and your right to say no. It's okay that I don't want to help. I'm allowed to say no. My feelings matter too. When you respond with compassion and understanding to your own emotions, it can help to resolve both the guilt you feel about not wanting to help and whatever anger or resentment you have about the other person asking for your help. And the interesting thing is that when we free ourselves of those conditioned thoughts and emotions, we might find ourselves being open to helping in some way. The difference is that instead of this coming from guilt or obligation, it will come from a genuine desire to be there for someone that you care about. And even if you still decide to say no to the specific help that's being asked, you might discover other types of help that you would feel comfortable giving. Because our brain defaults to all or nothing thinking, we initially often see only two possible outcomes for these types of situations. We either help or we don't. But in many situations, there are multiple ways to provide some type of support. And if the other person is someone you care about and genuinely want to be there for, think about what you feel able to offer. Just be sure this isn't coming from guilt sneaking up on you to offset that fear of being selfish. If the help that is being requested is actually something you're willing to provide, but it conflicts with your schedule or physical energy or emotional resources, one possibility is offering the help at a different time that would be better for you. That might sound something like, I really want to help you with your move, but I can't do it that day. Then tell them when you would be available. Or if the specific help they're asking for isn't something you feel inclined to do, offer what you feel willing to do instead. If you just don't have it in you to help that friend move, offering to bring food to them after their long day, or to help them unpack or hang pictures or break down boxes are all ways to provide some support around the moving process that it is in line with your resources. It might feel very uncomfortable to imagine doing this as it will go against the grain of what you've been taught. We have such a fear of being selfish that we often don't even know how generous we already are. Take some time to observe the ways in which you do for others on a daily basis, often without even thinking about it. Then enlist a trusted friend or partner and practice on small things that truly don't matter, or role play hypothetical scenarios so you can work on not automatically responding yes to requests for help without at least first checking in with yourself. Remember, when our own needs are met and our feelings are respected, we will typically be more than happy to help others. When we are generous, loving, compassionate, and supportive toward ourselves, that is how we will show up for the people in our lives. A giving heart is one that is tended to and loved, and you are the best person to make sure that happens for yours. That's it for this week. Take care.